and welcome to the New Canaan Library. I'm Alice Knapp, Executive Director of this library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2012 William Attwood Memorial Lecture. Lectures such as this one do not happen in a vacuum. In this case, it is the members of the Attwood Committee that meet to decide who to invite, who is that one person who encapsulates the essence of William Attwood. And due to their efforts, we are here for an evening with Louis Lapham. So thank you to the Attwood Committee. Following the lecture, there will be time for questions and answers. For the benefit of others, please wait until Stephanie Schechter hands you the microphone before you ask your question. And then there will be a reception upstairs in the H. Pelham Curtis Gallery at the conclusion of the program. More importantly, I want to say thank you to all of you who have made a contribution to the library's annual appeal. Your contribution makes these programs possible. There's still time for you to make a donation this year and support the activities of the library. And if you'd like more information on how to give, please see me, stop by my office, call or email, or go to our website and donate online. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Pete Runette, who will do the honor of introducing Mr. Lapham, who will be talking about history as natural resource and applied technology uses of the past.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 22nd Annual Attwood Lecture. Your program outlines the history and background of the lecture series and the career that launched it. I would like, however, to introduce to everybody Susie Attwood, who is here with her daughter, Anya. Maybe you'd like to stand, Susie. Bill Attwood's lifelong interests in journalism, literature, government, and politics are mirrored by those of our guest, who comes not only with professional standing but personal ties to our community. Most everyone here is aware of what our Waveney property has meant to New Canaan and of the associated Lapham name. Briefly, Waveney was purchased in 1904 by Mr. Lapham's great-grandfather, a co-founder of Texaco, and came to the town through the Lapham family, as did the Lapham wing of this library. Louis grew up in San Francisco, where his grandfather was mayor during the war from 1940 to 46. He came east to Hotchkiss and Yale, and after exploring a career as a historian in the course of a year at Cambridge, decided on journalism. His journey soon led to Harper's Magazine and editorship there for nearly 30 years. Harper's, as you may know, is the oldest and continuously published monthly magazine in the U.S. Under Lewis's leadership, the magazine innovated with such iconic editions as Harper's Index and Readings, resulting in multiple national magazine awards, as well as awards for best essays and best short stories. Having become editor emeritus in 2006 and been inducted into the American Magazine Editors Hall of Fame, he has continued to write a column, but focused his primary attention on the launch of a new publication, Lapham's Quarterly, which has been enthusiastically received. And there are these samples upstairs when you go up to the reception afterwards, in which you can take a look at the publication. And if there aren't any subscription possibilities up there, you can find it on laphamsquarterly.org. And we've received an anonymous donation to the library in the name of Pat and Hud Stoddard, has ensured that the library will be a subscriber henceforth. Although he's written more than a dozen books, authored a documentary movie, and currently interviews historians and scholars in historical context on Bloomberg Radio, he has said that he basically considers himself an essayist. He's described the Quarterly as, quote, the great books made topical. And reflecting his enduring commitment to history, he's also observed that, quote, historical consciousness has gone missing from the public and private sectors of our country, unquote. It's our good fortune to be about to have some of our historical consciousness restored by an expert. Please welcome Louis Lapham.
It's a true pleasure to be back in New Canaan. I spent a lot of time here when I was younger, and it's a truly beautiful place. and I'm delighted to be talking to the friends of the New Canaan Library. History is a work in progress, a constant writing and rewriting as opposed to museum-quality sculpture in milk-white marble. To read three histories of the British Empire, one of them published in 1850, the others in 1900 and 1950, is to discover three different British empires on which the sun eventually sets. The must-see tourist attractions remain intact. Napoleon still there on his horse at Waterloo, Queen Victoria enthroned in her palace at Windsor, the Indian subcontinent firmly fixed to its moorings in the Indian Ocean. But as to the light in which Napoleon, the Queen, or India are to be seen, accounts differ. Each age revises its conception of the past to fit the context of its present. And by and large, the historian will find the facts that prove the truth of his interpretation. History is not what happened 200 or 2,000 years ago. It is a story about what happened 200 or 2,000 years ago. The stories change, as do the sightlines available to the tellers of the tale, both the eyewitness and the historian, bound to their respective vantage points on the shores of time. Montaigne, in one of his essays, provides, as is his custom, an apt quotation. "See how Plato is moved and tossed about, every man glorying and applying him to himself, sets him on the side he wants. They trot him out and insert him into all the new opinions that the world accepts." Not being a scholar affiliated with an academic tenure track, I don't much care whether the mise en scène is Athens in the 4th century BC, Paris in the 1740s, or Moscow in the winter of 1905. I look for an understanding of the human predicament, to discover or rediscover how it is with man, who he is, and how it is between him and other men. To consult the record in books both ancient and modern is to come across every vice, virtue, motive, behavior, obsession, consequence, joy, and sorrow to be met with on the roads across the frontiers of the millennia. What survives the wreck of empires and the sack of cities is the sound of a human voice confronting the fact of its own mortality. The historian Sarah Bakewell, in How We Live, her own recent book on Montaigne's life and thought, compounds his apt quotation with the further and corollary observation that she borrows from Virginia Woolf. Any live mind is of the very same stuff as Plato's and Euripides. It is the common mind that binds the whole world together, and all the world is mind. Where else do we live, if not in a house of straw made from the reshaping of a once upon a time? What else is it possible to change, if not the past? The future is non-existent, the present come and gone so quickly, or too quickly, to establish a mailing address. Valued as both natural resource and applied technology, the reading of history finds room at the inn for the freedom of one's own mind, makes possible the revolt against what G.K. Chesterton once called the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. The observation is in line with George Orwell's dictum: who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Orwell was talking about the uses of history as propaganda bent to the service of the state. The better deployment of the dictum is to the purposes of the individual. Who is the who, if not oneself? And how else does one find that self, if not by rummaging around in the attic of history, which is the furnishing of one's own mind. Cicero made the point 50 years before the birth of Christ. Not to know what happened before one was born is always to be a child. It is the ignorance of the past that invites the despairing of the present, which in turn leads to the marketing of dead-end politics with ad campaigns for a lost golden age. As often as not, the nostalgic sales pitch, city on a hill, amber waves of grain, majestic purple mountains, is the contrivance of a reactionary status quo, floating the speculation of a redeeming tomorrow with subprime borrowings from an imaginary yesterday. Thus, Mitt Romney last September at the Voter Value Summit. We will preserve America's character as the land of liberty. We admire the entrepreneur, the inventor, the innovator. We will insist on greatness from every one of our citizens. Or President Barack Obama delivering the State of the Union address last January. We can restore an economy where everyone gets a fair shot and everyone does their fair share and everyone plays by the same set of rules. What's at stake aren't democratic values or Republican values, but American values, and we have to reclaim them. I listened to the speeches and to the candidates offering to take America back. Back where? From whom? What means of conveyance? Aboard the Mayflower or at the point of a gun? If back home on the range, do the deer and the antelope still play with the Teton Sioux? If from the grasp of venal politicians and vampire capitalists, does Ralph Waldo Emerson go to Washington and Commodore Vanderbilt to prison? The campaign rhetoric plays to the popular suspicion that somehow something has gone badly wrong with the American dream. The expressions of betrayal show up on both the disaffected right and the disillusioned left. In the pages of The Nation and the Weekly Standard, in the Tea Party proclamations and the movement to occupy Wall Street, all present taking note of America's wandering eastward out of Eden. The same disheartening message streams through the firmament of the blogosphere. The motion sustained by the public opinion polls that show 90% of the respondents believing that the country is on the wrong track. Book publishers flood the market with melancholy tracts likening the decline of the American Republic to the fall of imperial Rome. The New York Times reports that the world's newly emerging democracies no longer fit their constitutions to the 18th century American model, choosing instead to take their cues from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms or the European Convention on Human Rights. Foreign Affairs asks on its cover, "Is America over?" and follows up the question with an essay concluding that, yes, Virginia, probably it is. Done to death by inequality that hardens society into a class system imprisoning people in the circumstances of their birth. Goodbye to Huckleberry Finn, no more upward mobility for Horatio Alger's Ragged Dick, both God and Mammon outsourced to Bangalore. As with the snapshots sent home to Mom and Dad from a winter vacation in Hawaii, the postcards from an illusory American past, the innocent Arcadia over the rainbow of the mid-19th century western frontier, the classless society that is at the root of fair-minded free enterprise and all things innovative and entrepreneurial. The postcards don't mention any unpleasantness or inconvenience. The pioneers going west in the 1840s carried with them the promise of a land of milk and honey into what proved to be a desert. The 2,000-mile length of the Oregon Trail was littered with abandoned wagons and newly furnished graves. The juvenile delinquents at play in the sandbox towns of Deadwood and Nacogdoches didn't challenge one another to heroic duels in the sun. Best business practice was to shoot the scoundrel in the back at long range and with a rifle. Fortunes were to be found in 4 fields of endeavor: cattle, mining, timber, real estate, all of them heavily dependent on government subsidy. The romance of the West, so fondly embraced by President Ronald Reagan, was the invention of the literary East. The early scripts drafted by 19th century Ivy League swells by Francis Parkman, Owen Wister, Teddy Roosevelt, and Frederick Remington. Subsequent production values supplied by immigrant film merchants arriving in Hollywood in the 1910s from Warsaw and Budapest. The postcard likely to brighten the hopes of this year's presidential election is the one picturing the classless society. And for the next 6 months, at every Democratic or Republican fundraising dinner, charging $5,000 for the poached salmon, the speakers on the dais can be counted upon to shed tears for the dearly departed egalitarian state of grace. The message is nonpartisan, fit for delivery in a Beverly Hills ballroom or an Oklahoma hospitality tent. Each party holds the other responsible for stirring up class warfare between the 99% and the 1%. The only thing worth noting in either the ballroom or the tent is the absence of a quorum closely associated with, seriously angry about, other than rhetorically interested in the fact of being poor. Were the invited bank balances to be somehow so informed, they also might be permitted to remember that America has been relying on the convenience of a class system since the good old days in Puritan Massachusetts. But even if they knew of such a thing, maybe having heard tell of it in a novel by Edith Wharton or F. Scott Fitzgerald, one doesn't speak of it in polite company. The topic is in bad taste, well below the salt. Possibly because I was born into what in America fits the description of a privileged class, I'm hard put to pretend that it doesn't exist. So would have been America's founding fathers, almost all of them men of property, setting up a government hospitable to the acquisition of more property. Unlike Magna Carta, the Constitution doesn't contemplate the sharing of the commons inherent in a bountiful wilderness. It provides the means of making manifest an unequal division of the spoils. Thomas Jefferson didn't confuse the theory, all men are created equal, with the practice. Money, not morality, is the principle of commercial nations. Which is to say, a government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. Obama beholden to Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase, Romney risen from the black lagoon of Bain Capital. The news is maybe unwelcome, but it doesn't come as a surprise. Where in the record books does one look for a government of the poor, by the poor, and for the poor? How else does a society know or govern itself, if not with guidelines shaped by some form of class distinction? In the United States, the table of organization is for sale, made with money instead of an aristocratic birthright, the favor of a king, or the grace of God. Students at Yale College in the 1720s were ranked in the order of their pecuniary decency. The boy at the head of the class was the richest boy in the class. So were the dance cards at the balls in colonial Philadelphia. The young ladies in the room swept up into the music in a sequence dictated by their net worth. Of the first 10 presidents of the United States, 8 were blessed with holdings, land, rents, capital, slaves, valued in today's currency at more than $20 million. Add to their company the 2 presidents, Roosevelt, Herbert Hoover, John F. Kennedy, Bush père et fils, and the White House during the better part of its term in office has served as a second home for money. At no point in its history has the country not been nailed to a cross of gold. Mark Hanna, the Ohio coal merchant managing William McKinley's presidential campaign against William Jennings Bryan in 1896, phrased the proposition in a form that our own cable channel commentariat still plays as late-breaking news. Hannah said, "There are two things that are important in politics, money, and I can't remember what the second one is." The Supreme Court last year sustained the judgment with the Citizens United ruling that deregulated the market in political office, and thus ratified the opinion of John Jay, delegate to the Continental Congress in 1774, later Secretary of State. "Those who own the country," said John Jay, "ought to govern it." Nor at any point in its history has America declared a lasting peace between the haves and the have-nots. Temporary cessation of hostilities, but no permanent closing of the moral and social gap between debtor and creditor. Dipped at birth in the doctrine of boom and bust, the United States over the last 225 years has suffered the embarrassment of multiple bank panics and frequent collapses into economic depression. The worst of the consequences invariably accrue to the accounts defaulting on the loans of bourgeois respectability, the would-be upwardly mobile poor taking the fall for their betters. The notion of a classless society derives its credibility from the relatively few periods in the life of the nation during which circumstances allowed for social readjustment and experiment. In the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, again in the 1950s and 1960s. But for the most part, the record will show that the game securely rigged in favor of the rich, no matter how selfish or stupid, at the expense of the poor, no matter how innovative or entrepreneurial. A democratic society puts a premium on equality. A capitalist economy does not. Inequality, buy cheap, sell dear, is for capitalism the name of the game. Within the political arenas of the United States, the two approaches to one's fellow men as valuable citizen or valued customer have been more or less violently at odds since they provided Jefferson and Hamilton with their argument about the formation of a national bank. During the entire second half of the 19th century and the first 30 years of the 20th, class conflict presented the newspaper mills with their best and brightest headlines. Railroad company thugs quelling labor unrest in the industrial East. The Ku Klux Klan lynching black men in the rural South. The U.S. Army exterminating the Indians on the Western Plains. The populist and progressive movements, the Spanish-American War, the FBI rounding up communists, also liberals, anarchists, and aliens, 1919, 1920, and the crash of 1929. But to acknowledge the numerous flaws in the American scheme of things, in the past as well as in the present tense, doesn't disavow or negate the numerous perfections of its political and commercial enterprise, or of the many and magnanimous proofs of its humanity to man. To the contrary, democracy assumes conflict not only as the normal, but also as the necessary condition of its existence. The structure of the idea resembling that of a suspension bridge dependent upon the balance struck between countervailing forces. The project collapses unless the stresses oppose one another with more or less equal weight, unless enough people have enough courage to sustain the argument between the government and the governed, capital and labor, men and women, matter and mind. We squander the truth of our inheritance if we don't know how or why it was accumulated, against what odds, with what force of the human imagination, and which powers of its expression. John M. Barry's recent biography of Roger Williams offers a case in point. Certainly the earliest, conceivably the greatest, of America's forefathers, Williams, a Puritan dissenter threatened with imprisonment or death in Jacobean England, removed to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1631. Becoming known for his two eloquent improvisations on the theme of conscience and his unorthodox pleadings from Scripture, he soon fell afoul of the authorities in Governor John Winthrop's shining city on a hill. The settlement was intended to embody the glory and the will of God, in any given way to unauthorized expressions of feeling or thought resulted in punishment that was both cruel and prompt. Excommunication, which prohibited all speaking to other members of the community, even to one's own husband or wife. The slicing off of the perp's ears, adulterers of both sexes chastised with whips. Williams refused to conform, believing that man's dealings with God were not subject to government regulation. And in 1636, deemed to have committed both the spiritual sin of pride and a temporal act of rebellion, he was condemned to banishment in a British prison. Williams dodged the ship sent to carry out the sentence, and at the age of 33, forced to abandon his home, wife, and 3 children, he departed on foot from Salem in the dead of winter, accompanied by a band of Narragansett Indians to whom he could speak in their own language, the only Englishman in North America at the time capable of doing so. Making his way south to what is now the state of Rhode Island, Williams established the first government anywhere in the world that granted its citizens the freedom of religious thought. William, fluent in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, as well as Algonquin, friend to Sir Edward Cook, Oliver Cromwell, and John Milton, Williams, over the course of a long and uneasy life, abjured the comfort of moral certainty, and never believed himself safe in the hand of Providence. From the books and pamphlets that he published in the 1640s, while in London petitioning Parliament for Rhode Island's charter, John Locke borrowed much of the thinking subsequently transferred by Madison and Jefferson into the argument for the American separation of church and state. Williams's courage of mind assured him of persecution by the agents of the Crown in England, by the Puritan inspectors of souls in Massachusetts. And to read the story of his life is to be reminded that what Williams called the soul of liberty doesn't fall like pennies or a gentle rain from heaven. To know something of Williams other than the statue in the basement of the U.S. Capitol, moved from the Rotunda in 1997 to make room for the busts of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, allows room for argument not only with the sales promotions for a rose-colored past, but also with the dire prophecies of a future draped in funeral black. The Puritan divines, preaching to the 17th century faithful in the New England, never failed to see a world in ruins, so terrible the constant sight of Satan that they staged the delivery of their sermons with a fretful rubbing of tears from their eyes. So also our own secular news media blowing the trumpets of doom, consigning the end of the world as we know it to large, blind, and implacable forces, economic, political, cultural, and psychological, that determine the comings and goings of mice and men. The woeful noise under the Lord serves as a form of crowd control, instills the habits of obedience, bids up the market in surveillance cameras, restricts the freedom of thought as well as the freedoms of movement. As a secondary means of incarcerating the citizenry in a state of paralysis, politics packaged as light entertainment commodifies the voices of dissent, sells as its product the lame duck cynicism that stands as proof of being in the know, up to the mark, on pace with Bill Maher and Stephen Colbert. Key the laugh track, enjoy the show. History is fate, the way of the world is inevitable. That's wrong. The notions of historical inevitability propose a story with no people in it. overlook the fact that every age is an age of anxiety, subject to the humiliation of destabilizing change. The notions of historical inevitability forget that none of the onstage dramatis personae enjoy the luxury of hindsight. The course of events is contingent, as likely to turn on a shift in the weather as on the accidents of human personality. If a heavy fog doesn't drift into New York Harbor on the night of August 29, 1776, the whole of George Washington's retreating army, trapped by the British on Brooklyn Heights, doesn't make its escape in rowboats across the East River to Manhattan. And if the army doesn't survive, neither does the American Revolution. Nor does the revolution succeed without the assistance of France, which wasn't a gift from Adam Smith's invisible hand. The treaty followed from the particular quality of Benjamin Franklin's intelligence that allowed him to persuade an absolute monarch to bankrupt his kingdom in order to finance a democratic rebellion. Nobody dies in the country in which he or she was born. George Washington's America was not the America known to Abraham Lincoln, much less to the one that elected General Dwight D. Eisenhower to the White House, a fact of which I was duly reminded at my 40th college reunion in the spring of 1996. The after-dinner speakers marveled at the ways in which things had changed since our arrival on campus in the autumn of Ike's 1952 election, when a hamburger sold for 25 cents, a field-level box at Yankee Stadium for $5. The reunion goers spoke of invisible Negroes becoming visibly black, of homosexuals popping out of closets, of nice girls slipping off the silk of feminine restraint, of the interstate highway system's supersonic air travel, the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, manned space flight, the Vietnam War, the transplanted kidney and the artificial heart, Watergate and the end of the Cold War, the internet. The class secretary closed down the panel discussions by saying that no generation on the college's alumni books had weathered so heavy a storm of social and technological change. He didn't put the motion to a vote, none of the straw hats in the room being inclined to staunch the self-congratulatory flow of beer and sympathy. And it wasn't until somewhat later in the evening that I ran the numbers. On the day that I received my diploma in 1956, the class, then celebrating its 40th reunion, had arrived on campus in 1912, the year that sunk the Titanic. The turns of events over the next 44 years encompassed, among other occasions worthy of note, World War I, the Russian Revolution, American women granted the right to vote, Prohibition, the crash of 1929, the Great Depression, World War II, the Holocaust, and the atomic bomb. Which is to say that although history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. Allow for the variant customs of the country as well as for the geopolitical repositionings on the map of time, and the conflict going forward at the moment in Washington, Mexico City, and Beijing, like those that enlivened the annals of imperial Rome and the witch hunts in 17th century Salem, is the conflict between time past and time future, between the inertia implicit in things as they are and the energy inherent in things as they might become. The Roman historian Titus Livy likened history to a collection of fine things to take as models, base things rotten through and through to avoid. The contemporary American novelist John Crowley carries the thought another 2,000 years along the road to who knows where, suggesting that the past is the new future. Its lessons not simple or singular, a big landscape of human possibility, generative and inexhaustible. Crowley echoes the remark from William Faulkner, the past is never dead, it's not even past. Fortunately so. We have little else with which to build the future except the driftwood of the past, salvaging from the journey across the frontiers of the millennia what mankind has found to be useful or beautiful or true, on scraps of papyrus and scratchings in stone, on ships' logs and bronze coins, in confessions voluntary and coerced, in 5-act plays and 3-part songs. America's 18th century founding fathers exploited the resource of history as diligently as their descendants exploited the lands, forests, and rivers of the Ohio Valley and the trans-Mississippi frontier. They framed their several envisionings of a republic, Hamilton's and Franklin's, as well as those of Jefferson and Adams, on blueprints found in their readings of Livy, Cicero, and Plutarch. So in its turn, the Italian Renaissance derived from its rediscovery of classical antiquity. The latter progression supplies the historian Stephen Greenblatt with the premise of last year's best-selling The Swerve, which accounts for the death and resurrection of the nature of things, 7,400 lines of lyric but unrhymed verse composed by the Roman poet Titus Lucretius in the 1st century BC. Greenblatt gives to his book the subtitle, How the World Became Modern, attributing the metamorphosis in large part to the recovery of Lucretius's poem in a German monastery in 1417 by Poggio Bracciolini, Italian humanist, Vatican functionary, and apostolic scribe. Lucretius had infused his poem with the thought of Epicurus, the Greek philosopher teaching his students in Athens in the 4th century BC that the purpose of life was the embrace of beauty and pleasure. He based the proposition on a notion put forward in the 5th century BC by Democritus, that the elementary particles of matter, the seeds of things, are eternal. Everything that exists, the sun and the moon, waterflies, ziggurats, mother and the flag, is made of atoms in motion, constantly colliding and combining with one another in an inexhaustible variety of form and substance. The universe consists of atoms and void and nothing else. No God, no afterlife, nothing other than a vast turmoil of creation and destruction, the ceaseless making and remaking of despots and matinee idols. To the modern mind, atomic theory is old news, as it was to the schools of Stoic and Epicurean thought during the reign of Caesar Augustus. Christianity dispatched it to hell, reconfiguring the pursuit of pleasure as sin, the meaning of life as pain. The recovery of de rerum natura restored it to the land of the living, and by pooling its resources with those dormant in the works of Ovid, Seneca, and Plato, the Renaissance redrafted the contract between man and nature. Its embrace of truth as beauty and beauty as truth made manifest in the glory of its painting, sculpture, music, architecture, and literature. Over the course of the next 6 centuries, Lucretius's poem finds further development and expression in Machiavelli's political theory, Montaigne's essays, Shakespeare's plays, Newton's mathematics, and Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. The circumstances at hand in the early years of the 21st century suggest that the time is ripe for another redrafting of the contract between man and nature, with any luck of a magnitude comparable to the one that gave birth to the Renaissance. For the last 50 years, it has been apparent to the lookouts on the watchtowers of Western civilization that the finite resources of the planet cannot accommodate either the promise or the theory of infinite growth. The simple arithmetic, too many people coming into the world, not enough water, oil, food, phosphorus, underwrites the vast landscape of trouble listed under the headings of worldwide environmental degradation and financial collapse. I read the relevant policy papers on health, education, debt, poverty, homeland security, climate change, the extinction of species, the wars of all against all, and I notice that they tend toward a common awareness, dimly grasped but distinctly felt, that a global consumer society if left to its own devices, must devour the earth. Not with malice of forethought or as a matter of ideological principle, but because that is its métier. The scorpion that kills the frog, on whose back it is crossing the river because it knows not what else to do. The intimations of mortality lurking in the depths of the policy papers lead in turn to the recognition of the capitalist economy as an historical construct, and therefore, like a college reunion class in the Colossus of Rhodes, a collision of atoms en route to recombination or the void. A story with a beginning in the 16th century Holland, a middle, the 18th and 19th century industrial revolutions in England and America, and an end, foreshadowed by the financial convulsions of the last 20 years. Sensing the approach of maybe something terrible slouching toward Wall Street to be born, the lookouts look for salvation to technologies as yet undreamed of by man or machine. My guess is that they're looking in the wrong direction. To acknowledge the truth of the old Arab proverb that says we have less reason to fear what might happen tomorrow than to beware what happened yesterday is also to say that we have more reason to look to the past, history, the phoenix in the attic, for the hope of the future. Thank you. Yeah. I've worked it up into an essay that's going to appear the next couple of months next month in Harper's Magazine, and I didn't read the whole thing, but I'll give you the whole thing.
My comment would be, in the recent bestseller, The Black Swan, the author makes a contention that historians are excellent at analyzing the past, historians are excellent at explaining the past, and historians are terrible at predicting the future. I wonder if you'd care to comment on that, and does that affect the way that we should regard history?
No, because I'm not just counting historians. In other words, I'm counting Lucretius as a poet, and Montaigne is an essayist, Shakespeare is a playwright, Euripides is a playwright. I mean, this is our inheritance. Goethe says, he who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living hand to mouth. And I'm not talking about history books. I'm talking about the historical record, which is literature as well as sculpture, as well as philosophy, as well as, totem poles. I mean, it's the whole enormously vast landscape, as Crowley points out, landscape of human thought and possibility. I'm not just talking about historians. When I say history, I mean the historical record. Well, science works that same way, because science is constantly building on itself. I mean, one generation of scientists will learn from the prior generation of scientists. The work, it's a constant work in progress. And I'm talking about our cultural inheritance in the same kind of way.
Thank you for your very, very enlightening speech. I appreciated the part about the class distinctions and the desire for money. And I spent 3 years in China opening a business there, and I was there in the very, very early days of what is called the miracle. It really was a huge study in big government and an economic system that simply failed. It was horrid at the end of the time it collapsed, and Deng brought in both opportunity and competition. My question is, you see very little written about what happened to communism after the huge experiments in China and Russia, and the collapse of those things, and yet we have people today who are saying, one-class society, why do we have the distinctions? My question again is, why don't we see more about what happened in those two huge countries?
Well, I think we do. I think there have been quite a number of books about what went wrong in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union started to go wrong very soon. I mean, it begins to go wrong in the 20s. It turns into a totalitarian police state. It completely suppresses the imagination and creativity of its own people. And the greatest resource that any country has, any society has, is the mind of its citizens, collectively. I mean, that's why I think that where one has to invest money is in the improvement, education of one's people. That's in Jefferson's mind. That's also in Tom Paine's mind. And again, the perfect society doesn't exist, and as far as I can tell, reading around in the record, has never existed. The question is, are you going to work toward it? Again, it's like trying to get halfway to the wall. You never get there. But you have to keep trying, and you have to keep thinking, and you have to keep asking questions and experimenting. And the trouble is, if you rely too much on money, if you think that the future can be bought instead of made, you're in real trouble. And that's why, again, that's why empires tend to collapse and societies change and renew themselves. Yes, sir.
Question. Your comments and references and persona were all Western civilization.
That's.
Would you please comment on the lacuna to the rest of the world?
I'm at a loss for that. We try to do that in the quarterly. If you take a look at it, we try to have voices from China, Islam, other cultures, but I am not, and we have a number of people on our editorial board who help us in that regard. So if you look at the quarterly, you will see a much fairer representation of the other cultures. It's my own weakness that I don't have any. I'm not schooled in Chinese history or thought.
You made a mention of American dream.
I'm sorry?
You made a mention of American dream.
Yeah.
I wonder what does it mean?
Well,
by definition, if it ever happens, it's no longer a dream.
As I interpret the American dream to mean, it's a slogan, and it sort of means what people want it to mean, or what it is felt to mean. And to me, it's the notion of infinite growth. It's the idea of Faust. It's the idea of infinite expansion, extension. It's the idea of more. And I don't think that idea is going to be, what shall I say, on pace with the circumstances of the 21st century. I think that the American dream assumes infinite growth. You can be anything you want to be, you can have it all. There are no limits. And that's just not true. Yes?
Yes, I enjoyed your talk very much. It was very pleasurable. Thank you. And I was just wondering if you could help me summarize your talk in my own mind. If you were to, could you help me understand what maybe the two most key points are of your talk that I might remember next year.
The key point is that the history is a great resource. First of all, as a technology, it's a way of allowing you to read the newspapers, and it's a way to discover the nature of your own mind. In other words, we all live in a house of straw shaped, that we reshape, is a reshaped once upon a time. And to know what that once upon a time is leads to your own freedom of thought. And because Cicero's point, not to know what happened before one was born is always be a child. The other way to say it is, if you don't know your own story, if you don't know where you come from or how you got here, it's hard to know where you're going. So as a technology, it's navigational. It helps you to read the newspapers. It helps you to find out what you think. It helps to discover who you are. As a resource, it is, as I said, or Crowley has said, and again, as Faulkner says and Goethe says, it's an enormous, it's our inheritance. It's the cultural history of mankind. It's what men have saved on their 8,000 year journeys from the mud cities of Mesopotamia, and what they say is beautiful or useful or true. And we can learn from that. History is a wonderful means of learning. So the 2 points are technology, find out who you are, what you think, and 2, resource, to learn that there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in our philosophy.
One of my favorite titles of a book is The Studs Terkel, The Good Old Days, They Were Terrible.
Yeah, I mean, yes, if you ask any resident, if you could go back and check it with somebody who was living in one of the good old days, that's not what they would tell you.
The other point was studying economic history and seeing what's happening today. It's as though nobody ever had a clue about what happened in the past. We're doing all the wrong things.
Well, I mean, that means we have to keep inventing the wheel. I mean, which is a shame.
Well, I don't know what to say. Maybe I shouldn't say anything, but I feel like a very uncomfortable scorpion here.
Oh, good.
Riding on the back of that frog. I can't leave here tonight, Mr. Lapham, without some sense of hope.
I gave it to you at the end.
You better give it to me again, because I'm thinking I'm preoccupied with reforming myself into a scorpion.
I'm saying that history is contingent, that it's a work in progress, that it is not fate. You can think your way out of it. I mean, a lot of it is accident. We are not doomed, if that's by any means. And I'm saying that to use history as a resource is a way to work our way out of the puzzle.
You mentioned in passing the Supreme Court case, the Citizens United.
Yeah.
Which to me is one of the most important events of at least the last 20 years in this country. I do believe in the American dream as a reality, but it seems to me this is a fundamental challenge to that dream. In your mind, is there any concise way that we can do something to change it?
Yeah, we can. I mean, sure. Well, I don't know if we can. I don't think we can promise infinite growth, because I don't think that will work. The idea of a global consumer society, to me, seems to be an idea that it doesn't have a lot of legs at this moment. But in terms of developing your own mind, in terms of finding some balance between man and nature, I think that's certainly doable. I mean, I guess it depends. It depends on making a distinction between the price of a thing and the worth of a thing. And the way our consumer society is made up at the moment, they conflate the two. They think that the price of the thing is equivalent to the worth of the thing, and that's not true. So if you go back and read the philosophers, read Socrates or Epicurus. I mean, they're not talking about an immense amassment of stuff. They're talking about what Virginia Woolf says. I mean, the world is mind. And in many senses, that is the way that the founders of the United States felt. If you read Tom Paine, that is his idea of freedom. The freedom is freedom of your own in your own mind. I'm sorry. I tend toward a philosophical answer. I'm not a very good politician. I would have a hell of a lot of trouble raising votes on that platform, right?
Lewis, good afternoon.
Yes, yes.
I was wondering if you accept your premises and your thoughts about history and how it's changed and its importance and all your premises, how has the current world, the current technological development, one big one, the internet, social networking.
Right.
It seems to me that we may be going through a period of time like we've never gone before, which may change some of your premises and change the future. And Tom Friedman's The World is Flat. He's clearly a believer that the next 20 years will in no way, in these fundamental ways that you're talking about, is going to change society, change human nature, change governmental boundaries. So, I mean, it's going to change. Would you reflect on the internet as it, in social network, in all the ways that are new, technology, changing the future being so different than the way you characterized it today?
Well, there's no question it's going to change it as a means. I mean, it gives us a new language. I mean, the Marshall McLuhan's point is that we shape our tools and our tools shape us. And that the revolution, he compares the revolution from the idiom of print to the idiom of television and film. The book Understanding Media is before the internet, but it's along many of the same lines. I mean, it does teach people to think in different ways. That's true. I mean, when you write in small takes, I mean, the way the television language works is it goes around in circles. I mean, it's not coherent thought. I mean, how do you shape a political idea? Well, let's go back. Go back to the Constitution. Go back to the last 25 years of the 18th century in the United States. Everybody's literate. They all know how to write. They all write at great length. They're all historians. The Lincoln-Douglas debates go on for 3 hours. I mean, now to try to reduce, if you're a politician and you're campaigning and you're trying to reduce a thought to a short period of time, it's a different language and it's a different way of thinking. I mean, I was once, I did a 6-hour television documentary once on the history of American foreign policy in the 20th century, and the way it turned out, when it got down to it, was I had to connect a still photograph of the Munich conference of 1938 and news footage of the Luftwaffe bombing Warsaw in 1939, and I had 73 seconds in order to write the voiceover connecting the still footage with the film and at the same time explain the origin of World War II. So, I mean, that can be done, but it's a new kind of language. I think we'll find a new way of writing for the internet, and a new way of writing and a new way of thinking changes the world. But you got to, then you go back. I'll quote George Orwell that before you can find a language that makes social or political change, you have to find language that induces a change of heart. I mean, yes, I mean, but I think, Chuck, the more I look at it, I mean, I'm a completely amateur historian. I never managed, I didn't have the temperament to become a scholar. So I'm a true amateur. I mean, but the more I read of it, the more I find that almost every period is a period of change. People are constantly, I mean, again, think of the class that graduated from college in 1912 and had their 40th anniversary in 1956. I mean, think of what they went through. Movies, television, the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb has changed our attitude toward the world in ways we may not even yet fully understand. And it takes time for people to understand what they're up against. Very seldom at the moment do people really comprehend what's going on. And then again, of course, we all live in our heads. We live in somewhere in the past. I mean, I've always known that my political thinking was behind the times. I mean, people have always told me that. And I was reading a book the other day about the history of the 16th century in England, and I finally figured out that I was 372 years behind the times.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is our final question.
Well, Louis, it's nice to see you again after meeting you, after your performance in the question of impeachment in 2007. In the past few years, organizers like Bill McKibben and filmmakers like Josh Fox have decried the extreme extraction of fossil fuels currently taking place in North America. Tar sands in Canada, mountaintop mining in Appalachia, fracking in the Marcellus Shale, and deep offshore drilling in the Gulf. How deeply do you feel the United States is embedded in the Cheney energy policies set in the last decade, and how will history judge our drive to energy independence?
Well, again, I mean, this is, as I say, democracy is an ongoing argument, and clearly we're not going to be able to give up oil in the near future. And yes, there are people who are concerned about climate change, concerned about protecting the environment, but they have to, it's no good having extreme positions. I mean, you have to work it out with the facts at hand. I mean, we do need the energy. And yes, there are ways to make the extraction of the energy less dangerous to the environment, and we should do more of that. And I know, for example, one of the people that back the Quarterly is a man named Tom Siebel, who has made a lot of money in the Silicon Valley in the 90s, and then now spends most of his time with philanthropy, and particularly with education, and to try to find new ways to do things. And he's put up a prize for $10 million prize for somebody that can design a house that is completely zero-sum energy. In other words, that makes its own energy and does not put a drain on the environment. And there are all kinds of people making efforts in the directions. I mean, you know, trying to change the fuel consumption, or people trying to figure out different kinds of engines. And I assume we will get there. But again, it's a matter of argument. And it's no good just taking an absolute position and saying that the world is doomed.